We used to think that power was the exclusive domain of elected officials and government. After all, transparency and legitimacy are among the founding principles of liberal democracies. But these days, actors operating behind the scenes have almost as much influence on policymaking as politicians. So how big and how powerful is really the European lobby industry? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. The European Parliament consists of 720 members from 27 different states. Add to that their assistants, researchers, chiefs of staff, and you get an army of several thousand people shaping the policies of the EU. There's a vast array of factors that could potentially influence the decisions they make and the trajectories of their day-to-day work. And some of those factors don't necessarily involve policy. Will they be invited to speak at a conference at an exotic destination? What kind of a hotel will they be staying in? Do they receive a promise of corporate employment immediately after leaving office? Everything, from their clothing to travel schedules and future career prospects, could be targeted by hundreds of lobbyists working in Brussels. Our first report examines the scope of this phenomenon and how often politicians cross the lines they should never cross.
The final weeks of 2022 rocked the hallways of the European Parliament. Eva Kalili, a Greek MEP and one of the vice presidents of the chamber, was arrested and charged with corruption. She was accused for playing a central role in a cash-for-favors scheme. Together with her partner, Francesco Giorgi, also employed at the European Parliament, they received large sums from the governments of Morocco and Qatar. In exchange, Kalili agreed to defend their record on human rights and freedom of expression. Giorgi later confessed to her involvement in the scheme, admitting he was responsible for handling the payments. 750,000 euros in cash were seized from Kalili's apartment in Greece. She was stripped of her duties as vice president and lost her parliamentary immunity. She continues to deny her involvement in any illegal activity, claiming she never violated EU rules on relations with lobbyists. Immediately after Kalili's arrest, the president of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, launched sweeping changes. She announced a zero-tolerance policy on shady meetings with foreign agents of influence and promised more transparency. A new code of ethics for members of the European Parliament was introduced, but it doesn't seem to apply universally to everyone, including Metsola herself. Her husband, Uko Metsola, was the leading lobbyist for the Royal Caribbean Group, a transnational travel giant. His employment was never disclosed to the Parliament despite a potential conflict of interest. All of this raised serious questions over whether Brussels will ever succeed in bringing the lobbying industry under control.
Do lobbyists representing both governments and corporations really have a firm grip on European policymakers? And is there such a thing as a good lobby? It's really hard to answer these questions without judgment. But tonight, we will try to do exactly that, with the help of our experts. Dr. David Marshall, University of Reading, Professor Andreas Dürr, University of Salzburg, and Professor Alberto Alemanno, EC, Paris. Good evening, gentlemen. I want to begin with you, Alberto, and ask you to provide us with some definitional clarity, because lobbyists are words pretty much acting as buzzwords thrown around in the public space, very often without reflection. What does actually mean to be a lobbyist, and also what's the difference between various types of actors of influence? Lobbyists, public affairs consultants, PR executives, advocacy groups. Where do we stand on that in terms of definitions?
Well, lobbying covers any activity aimed at influencing decision makers. When they're about to take a new policy or revising one, they are expected to meet a lot of actors who might represent special interest or general interest, like public health or the environment, And all this back and forth between civil society, broadly defined, and decision makers is often referred to as lobbying. However, historically, we have been seeing this activity being mainly hijacked by special interests, corporations, companies, hence this negative connotation of lobbying as something that is an activity only exercised by the few, not by the many. However, we see that a country like Poland or a jurisdiction like the European Union are more and more open to receiving input from the outside. And this is something healthy for democratic political process. Our decision makers, our politicians cannot be absolutely omniscient. They cannot know everything about what they're about to do and regulate, and therefore they need to listen to everyone. So in a nutshell, lobbying is a legitimate form of participation of civil society in decision making, but historically has been used and somehow monopolized by certain special interests, mainly corporations and companies. And this has shadowed the possibility for other actors like NGO or citizen movements to actually exercise the same sort of influence. But lobbying is a legitimate activity, is constitutionally protected in most of the European OECD countries. So this is the positive perspective of lobbying, something that is needed for our policymakers to have all the information they need in order to take informed decisions.
Thank you very much for that, Alberto, because actually we tend to demonize lobbyists in the public sphere, maybe unnecessarily. But I want to move to you, David, and actually bring you into that discussion. Building up on what Alberto said, I think there's one more aspect of lobbying or exercising influence that we haven't covered yet, that is lobbying on behalf of sovereign states. Because that was very much at the heart of the Qatargate and the scandal around the Greek MEP, Vice President of the European Parliament, Eva Kaili. She's been accused of acting on behalf of the governments of Morocco and Qatar, as we've heard. Where is the line between lobbying or something fairly illegal or shady and good old-fashioned public diplomacy in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when we're thinking about the line, I mean, just to follow up on Alberto, I mean, there's legitimate lobbying, and there's lobbying which crosses a line, which is corruption. So, and clearly the case we looked at, that we're talking here about sort of corruption. It's trying to exert authority with financial means. So that was a particular case. In respect to states, I mean, the political system is there to represent the European population, citizens of the European Union, and their grievances. So to the extent where if a law is happening, it's reasonable for collections of citizens, whether in a business format or independent format, to lobby. But so that's a clear distinction. In terms of states, I mean, states, yeah, I would agree that there are channels where states should go to. I mean, these are diplomatic channels. It's not to say that a committee in Parliament or the Commission, may not reasonably accept a submission from a state. That's fine, but I think going independently to MEPs becomes really quite problematic for Commission officials.
So to conclude our debate over definitions and to actually make the picture whole, I want to move to you, Andreas, and ask about something that is at the very center of your academic research, that is trade organizations and actors that represent a variety of different groups, companies, be it national or international. They're very often in the literature referred to as the black boxes of lobbying, especially international ones, because we don't really know what's on the inside of them. They sometimes expect themselves to be treated almost like international bodies, but they don't really subject themselves, or they're not willing to subject themselves to international regulations. How much do we know about international trade organizations or sector organizations? How powerful, most importantly, are they today in Europe?
Yeah, what we know is that about 30% of the actors that engage in lobbying in Brussels, in the European Union, are business associations. So they bring together a variety of corporations, either within one sector. So these would be sectoral business associations like the chemical sector, or even broader, so all business associations, all business actors, all corporations from a country, and they will be represented by a business association. And for corporations, of course, it makes double sense to use these business associations. On the one hand, because sometimes a company may not want its name to be linked to a certain agenda. So if you are critical of climate change, you may not want to engage in lobbying on yourself. You may want to delegate this to a business association, so in order to keep your brand name clean. And second, for many actors, for many smaller corporations, the costs of going to Brussels or to lobby in general are also very high. So delegating this to a business association makes a lot of sense. So you pool resources and you lower the price of lobbying for all of those actors. That being said,
I'm gonna interrupt you here for a second and ask you to elaborate, just so we get a full and very clear picture. When we have an international or a transnational organization operating in Brussels, how influential are they in a, let's say, hypothetical situation when we have trade negotiations between one bloc and another, be it the European Union and Mercosur? There are trade negotiations between the Latin American bloc and the European one still ongoing very much. How much do these organizations bring to the table in such a high-profile negotiation?
They obviously exert some influence. That's why also they exist. But it's easy to overestimate the influence that they exert. So first of all, many of these business associations, the preferences that they defend are not so clear-cut, because within a sector, often you have companies that benefit from a trade agreement and other companies that lose from that trade agreement. And so the business association itself may find it very difficult to come up with a clear-cut stance on that issue. And second, even if one business association takes a clear-cut stance, often it's counteracted, its influence is counteracted by other business associations. So think about an issue like climate change, for example. You may have some business associations that actually are critical of that issue. They don't want any climate change legislation. On the other side, you may have some business associations like the ones representing the producers of solar panels that are in favor of that legislation. So often we actually see counteractive lobbying, and that just cancels each other out. It's easy to overestimate the influence that these groups can exercise and exert on the European Union.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you very much for the analysis of the state of the European lobby industry, especially with regard to relations with sovereign states and other international bodies. But we all know that the lobby industry has many faces. So let's take a closer look at some of the other ones in the second part of our discussion. One of the most dangerous phenomena for liberal democracies is the process of revolving doors. It's a term that describes the uninterrupted flow of corporate officials to the world of politics and back. It's one of the ways transnational giants, especially tech companies, influence policymaking. Our next report examined the current state of the relationship between corporations and public authorities in Europe.
3 months ago, Aura Salla was among the 15 Finnish politicians elected to the European Parliament. On paper, she was a perfect candidate, bringing a mixture of youth and experience to the table. She had previously worked for 6 years as an advisor in the European Commission. Her resume included 4 years in the office of former Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. But after his term came to an end, Salla left Brussels and the public sector. She moved straight into public affairs, becoming the head of EU affairs at Meta, the owner of Facebook. Having spent another 3 years there, she returned to politics and is now an elected official with a democratic mandate. Her case sparked plenty of controversy, as it's a textbook example of revolving doors. Some media outlets even described her as a tech lobbyist disguised as a politician. Salla denies any links with her former employer, but she represents a bigger trend. According to data from the Corporate Europe Observatory, the scale of ties between tech lobbying and policymaking is enormous. Almost 3 out of 4 lobbyists employed by Meta and Google had previously worked for national governments or EU institutions. In as many as 13 cases, the transfer into the corporate world took less than 2 years. Sometimes revolving doors work on the highest level of politics. Neelie Kroes, former vice president of the Commission, secretly lobbied for Uber during her cooling-off period. In Brussels, no one is immune to the influence of the lobbying industry.
David, I want to start the second part of our discussion with you and bring in parts of your research, because you studied borderless and transnational lobbying. And that seems to be a phenomenon increasingly present, especially with tech giants Meta, Google, Amazon. Since they're so internationally present, it's very difficult to pin them down to any national regulations. So how can we talk about putting brakes or regulating anyhow their activities if we lack a universal, global perhaps, framework for those kinds of actors?
But I think to some extent, or in a relative perspective, the European Union has been quite successful at this in legislating against Microsoft, Apple, in ways which perhaps has been less so in sort of other national jurisdictions, including in the US. Have they been able to do this successfully? Yeah, probably not. Partly because the tech giants are very smart, technology changes, and bureaucracies and politicians are working behind the curve. So I think that there are genuine actions that have taken place and are continuing to take place. So I don't think it's entirely a negative story, but it's one of catch up. And yeah, I think that our political institutions are not best equipped to do this well.
So let's dive into this a little more with you, Alberto. We've heard in our report about the most kind of flagship cases. Obviously, Nelly Kroes was the tip of the iceberg. Just recently, we had the Finnish MEP, Ora Sala, who was just last year the head of public affairs at Meta Europe, now is an elected official with a democratic mandate. But even now, in the current conversations over the upcoming European Commission lineup, we have the case of Marta Kos, the nominee from Slovenia, who just last year was a corporate lobbyist and continues to refuse to disclose details of her employment, the accounts she worked on, etc., etc. That's reported by Politico just a couple of days ago. Is there any way that we here in Europe could put brakes on that phenomenon, and how widespread is it actually that we have this transfer of power and influence between especially tech giants and the world of politics?
I think it's very important to remember who is watching us that the phenomenon of so-called revolving door, the fact that some people working in government might be leaving the public service to join the private sector is not per se prohibited, and probably should not be prohibited, meaning that it's important that the doors revolve because experiences have to be transferred from one sector to another. We have a lot to learn from the private sector and from the public one, and somehow enjoy it. But of course, any transfer of individuals moving notably from the public to the private also carries some risk of abuse of power. The fact that somehow those people who were in a position of power in the public might be monetizing their access to power and selling access to their new employer or to their clients. And this issue of revolving door has been governed only partly at the European and at the national level. There are very little rules, or actually zero rules, for the European Parliament. So an MEP, a member of Parliament, on the day after he leaves or she leaves the European Parliament is not really bound by any obligation. As a result of the Qatar Gate, for 6 months, he cannot work in the public affairs industry, but is a very short period of time. And commissioners are subject to a longer period of approximately 24 months as a result of the so-called Barroso scandal, where the former president joined Goldman Sachs. But this per se is not enough, because as the Nelly Kroes case you have mentioned or alluded to, that entailed the participation of an outgoing commissioner responsible for technology, there might be a time in which during the very end of the mandate of the commissioner, that particular politician might be very interested in offers that will define her political future. And since we see more and more European political leaders, including in Poland, who tend to be young or younger than their predecessors, can you imagine of French President Macron being out of office in 3 years' time? The demand for this kind of individuals to get into the private sector seems to be irresistible. So we really need to prepare in a transparent manner a set of rules that can govern not necessarily prevent revolving doors from happening, and ensuring that somebody who has been having a public position should not abuse of that position by reselling contacts or expertise to actors that have been previously involved in the previous career. This is where the core of the matter lies. There are not many jurisdictions around the world that are getting this right. We are all a bit struggle with the phenomenon of revolving door, but as many times has been said, the sunlight is the best disinfectant. So we need to inject greater transparency in those transfer of powers between the state and the market, and vice versa.
Greater transparency, more rules. Let's talk about those a little more, gentlemen. Andreas, I wanted to ask you a question about accountability, especially within the realm of international institutions. Most of them actually do have some sort of regulations on how their members should negotiate or how they shouldn't behave in negotiations with lobbyists. But as we've seen in the case of Roberta Metsola and her husband, not even the leaders of these very institutions always stick to them. So how can we, the average Europeans, the electorate, increase the level of accountability and transparency in the institutions to which we elect ourselves, the representatives?
Yeah, I think the level of accountability has actually improved a lot over the past 50 years. So in the European Union, we have a transparency register that originally was it was a voluntary register, so lobbyists could register there. They had some perks from registering, but it was not mandatory. And then step by step, the rules on this have been sharpened. And Ursula von der Leyen recently announced when she just yesterday announced that there would be stricter rules still coming with respect to the transparency register, so that really require all lobbyists to register, and that more of the meetings that also senior staff members of the European Commission have with lobbyists, that they have to be declared, that they have to be made public via this via transparency register. But I think that these are very important steps, and I think everybody can actually benefit from this. This discussion started out with the bad, the often bad impression that lobbying gives to people, that the bad impression that citizens have of lobbying, especially in international organizations. And so to improve this, I think transparency is key, and it would be also in the interest of the lobbyists themselves to support very strict transparency rules. We have the strictest transparency rules internationally in the United States. There we have a mandatory register, and infringements of the rules that are set forward there, they come with hefty fines. And so something like this we would also need here, and I think that would really improve accountability, but it would also help solve this problem of the revolving door, because we don't have so much of a problem with a revolving door if all the lobbying contacts that these people then have are completely transparent. Then, I mean, there is no problem with people moving from the private sector to the public sector. We just need to know what exactly they are doing in both of those roles.
Gentlemen, that was extremely informative and a little bit counterintuitive, which I humbly believe is the best form of journalism. Andreas Dürr, Alberto Alemano, David Marshall, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the evening. There seems to be a growing awareness of just how powerful backstage actors really can be in politics. The tech sector is a good example, but they operate everywhere, from greenwashing fast fashion to concealing poor working conditions in the construction industry. Stricter rules alone will not limit their influence. Politicians also need to be held accountable by their own voters. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a closer look at the turbulent relations between Austria and Russia, as Austrians later this month will head to the polls to elect a new parliament. Make sure you're with us next Thursday. Have a good evening.